Good morning, everyone. I'm not a morning person, so for me, this is morning at 11:08. Welcome to the Dubai Watch Week Horology Forum. We are here to talk about a very exciting and confusing thing for many called NFTs. NFTs are a multi-billion-dollar industry, as fringe as they may seem, and they've had a very short and interesting life so far. They started out as essentially art collectibles, and they quickly moved to assets that were traded like stocks, which for a while, stocks that never went down, which is obviously really a fun thing to own. And now increasingly, they are brand engagement vehicles, and it's really the underlying technology below the NFTs that has industries like the watch industry and many of the luxury conglomerates that own some of these businesses. That's why there's such big plans for this technology. But as someone who talks about NFTs for a living, they are still very misunderstood, and they are incredibly difficult to explain to your mother. Just try it. I tried it a few weeks ago, and my mom's a very smart lady, but it was still a pretty challenging conversation. So rather than make that easier, I have three people on stage that I'm going to task with doing just that, explaining NFTs in detail to everyone in this room and everyone on camera. I'll start here. I have Nic Courdy, who is an artist who works with digital realms and physical realms with a lot of really interesting individual collectors, and also brands that you may be familiar with. I have Mojdeh Cutter from Time for Art, and I have Brian Govberg of WatchBox. They are going to do a much better job of introducing themselves than I would, so let's start here.
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job. Artist, designer, been working in the digital space primarily for the last number of years, and kind of got swept up in the whole NFT thing that took off in the last few. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm Mojdeh Cutter. I work at Swiss Institute, a contemporary art museum here in New York City. And through Swiss Institute, I'm co-developing an initiative called Time for Art, which is the very first benefit watch auction to support contemporary art. The auction is taking place in December of this year with Phillips, New York. So you'll hear more about that in the next few weeks.
I'm Brian Govberg, where I work with WatchBox, where we buy, sell, and trade collectible timepieces. And I'm also a fourth-generation retailer of brands such as Patek Philippe and Rolex.
Okay, so let's start out with the softball question. It's actually a really interesting question. For any of the panelists, where was the first time you heard the word NFT? What did you think? And then contrast that with sort of your understanding or experience with NFTs today. Somebody.
Sure, I can jump in. I feel like I was a little maybe late to the game, especially being a digital artist in this space. But really it was just through like people who follow me on social media. I would post work and they would say, hey, you should think about, selling your work as an NFT, or have you looked into NFTs? And then, it wasn't a few months after that there was kind of the explosion with the sale of people's work. And then I think after that, kind of the rest is history in terms of the flood that came. So yeah, I would say that was kind of my introduction.
And Brian, what about you?
I think for me, it was when clients started talking about trading in CryptoPunks and other forms of digital art, and just asking me how I thought it would affect the watch market, and was it similar, or were there similarities between the two? And I think that this started roughly around probably 2 years ago in earnest, and then slowly started reading about some major watch brands dipping their toe into the water, whether it was through authentication or actually issuing a piece of digital art themselves.
And let's talk about digital art. So, Nic is someone who works in digital art, and Mojdeh is someone who works at the axis of, art and luxury. One of the things that's hard for people to understand when they think of a crypto collectible is how can something be valuable when you can't touch it, right? It's a very visceral experience you have when you hold something like a watch with such history, such permanence, such craftsmanship. As a digital artist and someone who works in art, how can you explain the passion that people have for digital artworks? What do you think they're connecting to?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the digital space is just another tool for artists, and it kind of expands maybe what they're able to make. And I think, collectors who are interested in that see that and see that there is craftsmanship, that goes in. It may not be as evident as, say, like a brush stroke on a canvas, but I think the ones who are interested in it kind of dive into that. And I mean, I'll be the first to admit, I like to print work out and put it on my wall. Like, I like to live with the artwork as well. I think there are things that you can do to kind of make it feel a little bit more tangible. But I think what was exciting for a lot of artists and with NFTs was the fact that they could, especially for digital artists, kind of monetize or find a way to, finally monetize what they were doing without having to kind of find these alternative modes of kind of selling the work. So.
And what about the brands? I know you work with a lot of really prominent brands, and them hiring you to make digital art. When you have these conversations with them about their reason for doing so, what are they telling you?
Yeah, I think I've been fortunate with the collaborations that I've done, and I don't know what others' experiences are like, but it's been very much of like, hey, this is a thing. Like, maybe it's centered around a particular product, but they're not sitting there telling me exactly what to make, right? It is more of a truer collaboration where they have an idea or a mood board or a story, and we just kind of work together to do that. And I think those kind of opportunities are really important for artists, and it's a nice way for brands to kind of collaborate and encourage the space and kind of build that community. So.
And you've done an NFT yourself as an artist, correct? Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so, as I was starting to hear more and more things and doing my research, I thought, okay, I'm going to try and figure this out, right? And I think it was interesting because you had all these different marketplaces, and so you kind of really had to figure out, like, which one should I put my work on? Which one makes the most sense? And I really feel like the marketplaces probably struggled with demand because there was just so many artists kind of saturating the market, whether they're digital artists wanting to get their work seen or sold. You even had traditional artists taking photographs of their work and minting those on the blockchain. And so just an absolute flood into the market. But I felt like kind of the collector base wasn't necessarily there to support it. Anyway, ended up minting it on one marketplace, not getting the traction kind of that I desired. So actually burned it from that, minted it on another, and through a gallery in the Middle East, Emerge East, they kind of ran an NFT auction, and they were able to sell it that way. So, which, just want to say, I think kind of points to the importance of eventizing, if I can make up a word, of just like still having art events. Just because things are online or digital doesn't mean that everything needs to live on the internet. I think it's really nice to have events like this where people can come and get together, collaborate, talk about the space. So.
Well, let's talk about that. So you're working in art and luxury around events and auctions and things like that. How do you consider sort of the digital frontier with the kind of things that you're doing these days?
So, firstly, I would like to add to Nick's point about one of the things that I think is very, very exciting about the NFT phenomenon, that it is a way to really break down the barriers of the art world, that the art world, as you know, has created these high barriers to entry over the years, and that those barriers of entry are very self-preserved and they self-protect itself. And I think this is a way to really democratize art and make it accessible to a much wider audience, and to break down the inequity of arts patronage, for example. Particularly on the auction side that I'm working on with Time for Art, we're not exploring the NFT world just yet, but I feel like this is something that's here to stay. This is something that more brands and more luxury brands and even artists are going to keep working with, and it might take other shapes. It might not just be an NFT. We are in the very nascent stage of this new kind of practice or medium, and I think it is safe to assume that it'll take different shapes over the next few years. It might be something completely different, not just an NFT, just a different type of crypto token.
So it's interesting you say that, talking about patronage and tracking value, and we'll get into that. I think I want to talk a little bit about the the technology underpinning NFTs, because that's candidly, I think, is what is the most exciting, both in the longer term and really what the NFT experts are talking most about today. And there's some very simple examples. So when I was coming down here, I wanted to get some links put into the watch that I have now and get a few other things done. And so I took my watch out of its box and I thought to myself, I better bring this authentication certificate if I want these things done for free. Then I looked at this authentication certificate and it was this piece of paper that I easily could have duplicated in about 15 minutes on a printer, and more importantly, was terrified to lose, right? And one classic example of the use case for NFTs is I thought to myself, why is this authentication certificate not digital? Why do I have to carry it with me? Why do I have to worry about losing it? And we've seen brands like Vacheron and others experiment a little bit with digital authentication of physical goods. I have my watch, but the thing that proves to you that it is official and not a bootleg, and that I own it, and tracks the value and the history of purchases, is a digital blockchain certificate. What do you think about this, Brian, sort of in the world that you're in? You're in a world where you're seeing a lot of watches change hands. There's a practicality, and then there's also the idea that brands, through an NFT, like especially young American watch brands, could attach an NFT to the watches they make and write what they call a smart contract, which is essentially a rule, and make sure that every single time that watch is bought and sold forever, that the brand gets a cut. How do you think this sort of tracking and this sort of management of royalties could impact the resale industry and impact collectors globally?
A lot of questions in there. No, I think that we're in the infancy of the industry. If you go back 10 years, a lot of the watch brands didn't think that the internet would be sticky. So there was no selling online, there was no click and buy. And then if you fast forward to now, you have not even just boutique only, you have online only releases. So in a span of a decade, you have a complete reversal. And so I think that from the perspective of whether it's authenticity, that's the path of least resistance that you can take in terms of just having something that lives on the blockchain that authenticates the watch. On a practical use case, how this actually happens now, it's difficult because you have a physical good. When the physical good changes hands, for most consumers around the world, that's enough, especially if the watch comes with box and papers, which I think are the key pieces that a collector's looking for. As far as physical documentation goes, a lot of clients, you're buying into the history of the brand or the history of the product. It's not just it's not a widget. And so I think that there's something to be said for these documents that if you look at a Sotheby's or Phillips auction, that they were issuing these documents in the late 1800s or early 1900s. They stand the test of time. And then there's a lot of complications, right? You sell a watch or you trade a watch, and for whatever reason, the token itself doesn't get transferred. Who owns the watch? What happens then? So I think that there's a lot of complications that can arise from it, but it's in its infancy. The brands are just learning, the online players are just learning right now, and I think that we're not really yet sure where it's going to go or how it's really going to manifest, but that the technology itself is very useful and it creates a direct connection to the client, and it's going to be here to stay. As far as what you mentioned about brands participating in the secondary market value, I think this for me is one of the biggest use cases that hasn't yet really developed, more for smaller independents than the big brands themselves. I think that if you're an independent brand, it allows almost a futures market to be created where you issue a token that perhaps gives you the right to purchase a watch at a future date, and that once purchased, there's a utility to it. Maybe it entitles you to a trip to Switzerland or collectors meetups in New York, something that creates a sense of community even without having the watch. And then eventually, once the watch is delivered, you have the physical manifestation of the token. But before that, this token can trade, right? And as it gets closer to the date of delivery, it will trade closer and closer to the secondary market value of the watch. And so what this allows an independent or a micro brand to do is capture all of the revenue up front. And for them, every dollar counts. Every dollar goes into creating new product. It goes into marketing. It goes into creating the events themselves. And it also allows them to participate in the secondary market, where they know that the watches are limited, they know that there's a lot of demand and supply is not there. And so if you're producing 100 watches in a year and they're already selling for double the moment they're delivered, it gives that watchmaker the ability to participate in that upside as opposed to just the consumer participating in it. So, I mean, it's super interesting, and I think that this is where you're going to see it go.
So Mojdeh, when you were talking about sort of inequities in art patronage, is that sort of what you were talking about?
Absolutely, yeah. So as most of you probably know, if there's a contemporary artist, an emerging artist who's selling work through a gallery, and a collector buys one of their works, it might go for $1,000, and then the collector can later on sell the work at auction for much more than that. Sure, that might raise some visibility towards the artist and it'll create some buzz towards the artist, but they're not going to be receiving that financial gain. And that in itself is something that can be directly combated with through NFTs, and having the kind of ownership over your own work and receiving royalties as the same way that a watch or a watch NFT could go. Each time it changes owners or goes from hand to hand, the original person, the original artist or watchmaker can directly benefit from that. And I think that in itself is a huge feat that needs to be celebrated through the technology, this amazing technology. I mean, again, it might change, and NFTs might look totally different in a few years, but at the end of the day, it could still be used in its very utilitarian aspect of being used as a ledger, being used as a way to trace authenticity and provenance, and also to be able to keep receiving royalties, and to make sure that collective culture is acknowledged and recognized through and through.
Yeah, so you have a great personal sort of microeconomic story, right? The creator is rewarded as their creation becomes popular over time, right? But Brian, let's talk a little bit about the macro of things. So, when we started talking about this idea for a panel with the forum, the NFT market was in a different place. At this point, crypto wealth is just wealth. When you hear about the crypto billionaires, they are not gone simply because Ethereum and Bitcoin are down. They've made their money and they are just part of the luxury elite. And crypto itself is in just about every pension fund and financial instrument that exists right now. So that's not going anywhere. But for a while, there really was a trend of younger consumers who were making a lot of money in sort of alternative crypto investments very quickly, and who really identified and I think wanted perhaps the provenance and the prestige and the permanence that a great watch brings. And we're diving really headfirst into sort of the trophy watch category, as I understand it, and really ballooning sales. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. As someone who's working in a sales context, how have you been considering the crypto consumers? How have those conversations changed, and how do you look at sort of that audience segment?
I think that it became a new buyer that wasn't there before. So, and it became a completely new market segment. I think that this particular segment was educated to the fact that there was other ways to invest your money that were more interesting or dynamic and possibly more fun. And so they were the NFT buyer, they were the crypto buyer, and so they were able to more easily recognize watches as an alternative investment. And I think for that reason, they were happy to pour money into the category, perhaps in order to diversify what they were already doing, or to take gains that they had been making and move it into something else. Ultimately, it's gonna let's call it go up or go down, no different than any other commodity would, right? Like if you have countries that are pumping oil, when oil goes to the moon, you see that those markets start spending more on watches, and so it's always going to be the way of things. As those are making money, they're going to be putting it to use. So I think ultimately with watches, though, it was a younger segment, and for me, I think that's great to see, seeing that the traditional buyer who may have been 45 to 55 years old is now going as low as 20 years old. And so it opens it up to a whole different segment of buyers. It opens it up so there's more demand. And I think that as supply sort of stays maintained or stays tight, it's created the market that there is today.
Well, let's talk a little more broadly outside the NFT context for a second about just what it's like. Watchmaking's been going for well longer than a century. We're talking about, we're all here today because we really have an appreciation for the craftsmanship, the artistry, the science, really, and the history, right, and the permanence. I think something you said earlier, which is really interesting to me, was, no, the fact that this is a paper certificate and the fact that those early watches had a similar certificate, that matters, So what's it like from a market standpoint where you are selling something that has intrinsic value and really evident artistic value, but people are buying them for so many different reasons, right? So many people, when they're successful from sort of any industry, what do? They buy themselves their first watch, or they buy themselves that final watch, or they're so successful they now wear a cheap watch to show how successful they are, right? What's it like being in a industry that is so tied to permanence and history and quality, but yet you're constantly having to react to all these very different types of consumer demands?
It makes things interesting. I think that, for me, I find watches to be one of the ultimate forms of self-expression because there's just so many different directions that you can go in. Ultimately, though, as far as the product is concerned, I think that it's really just new consumers coming along that have different interests. And the watch industry has always adapted to this, and perhaps in the past it was to case sizes, right? Or color schemes or whatever it was. And I think that you're going to see that it's no different in that you just have to adapt to the kind of buyer that's coming along. But for us, it's adapting to the times and finding new ways to offer our watches for sale.
Right. And do you feel something that's similar, in the art that you do, right? You're producing art in the ways that watchmakers produce watches because they feel like this is something that is needed in the world. Yet the reasons people are buying art from you and the brands are collaborating with you are constantly changing and so personal. How do you as an artist address that challenge yourself?
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like if I understand the question, I don't necessarily know that artists are going in with this like intent to sell. Of course, every artist wants to sell so they can kind of proliferate and continue. But it's just kind of the creative aspect, like kind of having that outlet and being able to make something and then getting the kind of recognition for it. Ideally, maybe not. So I don't know. I think it feels a little bit different in the sense that it is a good, but like there's a lot more wrapped up into it than just saying like, hey, we're going to make this thing and try and sell it. And I'm sure the independent watchmakers or the watchmakers of the world feel the same way about their thing. It's just something that they love to do. And they would do it whether they sold the watch or not. So I guess there's that aspect. I don't know if that answered your question. But.
Yeah, no, I think it does. It's right. You've got a point of view as a creator, but, you essentially maintain your living by having others maybe not adopt that point of view, but buy into it or want to aspire to it, right?
Right, yeah. And I think, it's an interesting point about watches being kind of the ultimate form of self-expression because you can take it either way. You could take it the person who's making the watch or the person who's wearing it, right? That's how they kind of self-express themselves, which maybe is how you meant it. And I think, collectors of art are no different. They have a particular aesthetic or a particular area that they're really interested in. And so I think it'll be fun and interesting to see how the space grows, maybe as there's more diversification within the collector base of kind of NFT artwork. I don't know if that's necessarily something that we've seen by and large yet.
Yeah, it's so early. We really
Right.
haven't seen much of NFTs when you think about the life cycle. There's been so much economic value created, so much fluctuation in that value, and so much press. But when you really think about NFTs and their value, it's the underlying technology. When they talk about a distributed ledger, essentially NFTs sit on a blockchain, which is a piece of software, which is the same piece of software that powers Bitcoin and all these other coins you've heard about, more or less. And what that software does is it records the provenance, the history of it, the ownership of the asset that sits on top of it. And it also records the value, a ledger, much like a ledger you might have if you were a restaurant owner and you had a ledger of the various drinks and supplies that you had. And what's interesting is a lot of people think that the future of the internet may be built on NFTs and blockchain technology, because when we think about this, we are creating content through this forum that will be watched on platforms so that we can connect with one another. And yet the people that are profiting from that are the owners of those platforms. And now imagine a world where NFT technology is not just used to track, the watch that you sold to me and that I sold to you. It's actually used to track how we behave in an increasingly digital world. And because we understand the value that we create, we may start asking for some of that value. So really, when you think of why NFTs are interesting, it's because it can really be a marker of the value that all of us create as creators and consumers, from artists to people like me who just buy things on the internet, But let's talk about sort of the challenging things from a consumer standpoint. So NFTs are part of a digital goods industry that is $950 billion right now. And it is a digital goods industry that is growing twice as fast as the physical goods industry. When you look at research and surveys, we have young children. It is almost certain that absent some strong parenting from us, our young children will care more about their online presence, what their Twitter or Instagram or whatever the next platform page looks like, than what they look like. If you look at the video game industry, there are billions of dollars of digital goods being sold. Customizing how your digital basketball player looks is a bigger industry than selling the games, which is bigger than movies and music and television. So we're going to this world where people's digital selves matter to them more than their physical selves. What are we supposed to do as an industry selling these premier physical goods that are timeless? Like, how do we address this consumer shift while staying true to what makes, this industry so special and something that is not a trend?
From what I've seen, though, like, as quickly as the industry is developing and as much demand, I would say, as there is for digital items or digital goods, we've seen that much more demand come for physical goods. So I think that for the watch industry, I think it's just having the tether between the two, right? The physical item being tethered to something digital. And I think that something digital isn't just having, maybe it's a picture that looks nice that you're Instagramming out, right? Or like an avatar on Instagram. I think that it's having a specific utility. And whether, again, it comes back to community, whether it's meetups, whether it's events, there's a whole slew of things that the brand can do and offer to clients outside of just the watch itself. And more than ever, like, it's in the past 5 years, I think that the conversation went from how are we going to sell these things to we have too many people that want to buy these things. And so and they're all trying to create more positive visibility for themselves with less animosity, because so much of what we see is that there's just an animosity about not being able to purchase the physical good. And I think that you're going to see brands try and figure out a way to create that piece of digital engagement to make someone feel positive about a brand over the course of their waiting. And if they have to wait 5 years for something, that they're able to participate and feel a part of the brand over that 5 years.
Right. So the animosity is around the scarcity of either having to wait or I just couldn't get it.
I just couldn't get it.
I always bid on sneakers. I never get them, and I actually get really mad. And wouldn't it be great if I had a digital component so I could feel better about not getting my Yeezys, right? That
Correct.
would be ideal. Okay, that makes sense. I think you may actually work in NFTs secretly, because what we talk about in the NFT world, no, we really do. Increasingly, we talk about utility, and that utility is in our world called IRL, aka in real life. It's funny that we have an abbreviation for in real life, but we do. And we talk about utility, and we really talk about community. So maybe let's continue on the community train. As someone who is working in arts and as someone who's an artist, how are you using maybe people's penchant for sort of wanting to identify digitally and connect digitally? How are you using that to push the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think people caring more about their digital presence doesn't necessarily negate the fact that they're still concerned about their physical presence, which I think was your point too. They just use it as a way to kind of bolster their social status, I think, when they're in a physical space like this. And so I think that's one point. But the other about community is that's I guess the piece that felt a little bit missing over the last few years. And even now, like being in the city the last few days, trying to find, where are the spaces that I can go to talk to other NFT artists or hang out or see the work, right? There's really, Super Rare's gallery, I think, is the only thing left that I was able to find. If somebody knows of something, please let me know after the show. And I was able to make it out there yesterday and had a great conversation with one of the artists who has his work in there. But I think there needs to be more of that. And those type of spaces, which I think brands can get involved with, they can, kind of sponsor these types of spaces to help build that community. The more that we have and the more the conversation grows, I think the more that, it will validate this idea and of the community of buying digital art and kind of supporting that. And I ideally spread it around or spread the ideology to kind of a more diverse set of collectors.
And to your point, to answer your question about, if there's going to be the next generation of audience who's going to care so much more about the digital side, if that's the case, then that doesn't mean that the physical side or the IRL side will be obsolete. If anything, it's going to add more visibility and people are going to learn more about, let's say, watches, even if their first entry point is digitally. And I think that's just another way for people to engage and learn about something that is, has been around for so long and has so much tradition and history. And it is just another tool for another entry point.
Right. Yeah, and that really is the point. When you see these surveys of kids caring more about their social profiles than their lives, to your point, doesn't mean they don't care about their lives. I think what it's showing is that people are increasingly conversant digitally. It's funny, you said something just a moment ago, you wish there were more spaces in New York to get together with NFT artists. And I think there are probably a few more that I can help you find.
Sure.
But really a lot of those spaces live digitally, and there's an anonymity to those spaces that is very much prized by the NFT community. You can be anyone to be a successful artist, and you can also, converse as anyone. But the physical meetup part of it, I think, is something that's taking a little longer. Okay, so there's a professor in Boston College called Andy Hargraves, and he has a quote that I thought was really interesting and germane to this. He said that technological change must involve critics as well as advocates. And so I'd like to ask each of my panelists, perhaps I'll start with you, Brian, for a world that is becoming more aware of NFTs, I'd love you to be both a critic and an advocate. Tell me something that you think the watchmaking industry in general should perhaps be wary or cautious of, and then tell me something you may be hopeful for with the advent of this technology.
I would say if I was being wary, I think it would be perhaps taking the use case that someone else is using and just incorporating it as your use case because that's what's in vogue. I would be wary of. Just because it doesn't always translate across to the same customer. The same person that's buying a piece of digital art, right, is perhaps different than a watch collector, and just taking that use case and bringing it over and saying, okay, like this seems to be cool, this seems to be what people are buying, like let's just do it. I would probably be a little bit wary of because I think that it should be differentiated. But what I'm hopeful for is that watch manufacturers will learn more about who their true clients are, and it will create a better sense of community and more conversation between the two. Because at the end of the day, a person could have 20 watches from a brand and have never bought that watch primary. And that doesn't mean that this person's not a collector or that this person's not a collector of that brand. And perhaps the brand itself is viewing it that way right now. But over time, I think you'll see that change, and the brand will view that these customers that may have 20 watches as collectors of their brand, and they'll be able to speak to them directly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, again, you must work in NFTs. I'm unconvinced that you don't, because one of the things that we talk about a lot is data. There's a case for NFT ticketing. If you're a big rock star and you invite all of you to a concert and you buy tickets through Ticketmaster, the artist doesn't know who's coming to see them. And to your point, you have this robust secondary market for collectibles where people are paying ultra premiums and therefore one would assume are incredibly passionate about that brand and maybe have done so up to 20 times and they don't know. So I think when we talk about this, I would encourage all of you, when you think about NFTs, I wouldn't think of them as digital collectibles to compete with sort of the richness and the permanence of watches. I would think of them as digital augmentations to sort of engage, to excite, to make up for when they can't buy the watch just yet, or for brands to learn about the customers and how deeply they're willing to engage. So now I'm going to put you, Moj, on the spot with the same question. Be a critic and an advocate in this space for me.
Absolutely. So I think something that I'm wary of about NFTs is, are they going to be able to still hold the same kind of sentimental value or meaning that a physical object can hold? So my entry point into the watch world has been the human connection and the storytelling and all of the emotion that I feel through something that it's passed down from generation to generation, like a family heirloom. And I wonder if NFTs can have the same dimensional weight or meaning throughout generations. And if, and that in itself, is it going to be obsolete in a few years, aside from its very utilitarian tool of tracking and kind of database management in a way. So that's one question that I have. And just to add to Brian, I think something that's really exciting about the NFTs and you, as kind of relates to what I said at the very beginning, is that it can be just another new technology, a new way to engage with your client base, to do community building, to know your client base, and to also just be able to use it as a tool that will be a certificate and something that will last forever and forever. So I think about that with art as well. Art making and telling time have been around for, since the dawn of time. And on the other side, NFTs or crypto-based tokens or this kind of technology will most likely last forever until eternity. So I think of the two, kind of the physical and the digital, working together in tandem, and they can be in relationship together beautifully and benefit each other instead of being in opposition.
And it's interesting what you just said, right? This whole industry is about time, right? But we're at a really interesting intersection. We have this new technology that is just starting out in NFTs, and then you have the watchmaking industry, which is still going strong, more than a century later. And it's interesting when things meet at very different points in their life cycle. Nick?
Yeah, same question. I think probably one of the most polarizing things that happened amongst artists when NFTs started to really gain traction was just kind of the environmental impact. So I think, I'd like to see more, and I know that things are kind of being done, and research being done on how to improve that. But I think that's one thing that I think would elevate the space. And then in terms of advocating for it, I think just going back to the original function of NFTs, like if you look at the historical timeline, the idea was for artists to have graphic digital artists have a way to sell their work to collectors who are interested in it. And I think that's really exciting. I don't think that story arc is done. I think there's a lot more there to be explored, and I would just love to see more and more people get involved, both on the creation and kind of the collection side. So,
well, listen, at a conference about time, I don't want to go overtime, and we are at 11:45, and I'd love to open it up to the audience for any questions. I don't know how is there a microphone, or should people just stand up?
Thank you. Very interesting. Brian, you talked about the concept that there would be, when a product is sold in the secondary market afterwards, it's possible now for the creator to receive a share of the increase in value. Would that mean that the creator then reimburses the seller if the item goes down in value in a further transaction?
That's a good question. I mean, again, I think that this is one of those situations where we're in the infancy of the industry and that the use case isn't fully baked out yet, but it's just in terms of one direction that it can go. But on a realistic basis, I don't believe that the brand itself would be participating in the downside now. I mean, I think that, again, I think that you go into it under the notion that you are buying these watches for the utility of them and the enjoyment of them, and that you understand the costs that go into the production of it. And no different than today, if you're purchasing a watch and this doesn't even exist. I think that having this ability for an independent brand to be able to participate in the upside is something that's new, and it's a development that's occurred more predominantly over only the last couple of years. If you go back prior to 2018, this idea of over retail wasn't a thing. I mean, I remember the only watch that sold for over retail was the enamel Patek Philippe World Time. Like, that was the only watch in the entire industry that really brought over, and a stainless steel Daytona. That was it. And then everything else is traded at a discount. And so back then it was just about, what price were you paying for something? It wasn't about access to the product. And you can see in how 5 years that's completely turned on its head, where it's not even about price anymore. It's about access, let's call it, to product at the retail price, and or where you're paying relative to retail. And so I think that because of that, and because it's a new development, that it's going to be sort of figuring out where it can go.
Yeah, and I think just at a macro level, just as a consumer, right, one of the things that strikes me as so different about the watch world is you have these retailers and these families, right, who really seem in partnership with the brand in a way that a normal retail experience doesn't feel that way. If I'm buying something at an online retailer, it just sort of feels like they're the signpost and I just buy it because they happen to have it at the lowest price, right? But when I was making my purchasing decisions, it was important where I purchased my watch from, and it really seemed like they were in partnership. And I think what's interesting, at least theoretically, to your point, not fully baked in, is this would be a really great way for retailers and the people that really bring the history and the trust with consumers to really signal that they are in long-term partnership with the watchmakers, even beyond the many ways they already do.
Hi, thank you guys. That was such an interesting talk. I wanted to touch on a few points, a combination of points that you guys made. First of all, about utility, which is something that probably we don't talk about as much because it's all about the buzz, and that's what makes headlines. But the utility to consumers, the utility to the industry, the luxury industry, since that's what we're talking about. And also what you mentioned, Christopher, about the anonymity of NFT spaces. And I was wondering whether you could comment on how a combination of those factors could possibly lead to and aid in inclusivity, because it's true that in traditional luxury marketplaces, traditional points of sales, there are a lot of built-in barriers and assumptions based on the physical aspect of a customer, socially and culturally. So could that kind of be a thing that actually helps our community to grow, because it leads to that sort of frictionless community access without that burden of social and cultural assumptions about a customer based on how they look?
Can I comment on that? Yes. I think I completely relate with what you're raising with this, because again, I'm new in the watch field. Before starting this project called Time for Art, I had never stepped into a watch store before. I felt like it wasn't for me, not only as a woman, but also somebody who didn't know anything about watches. And I feel like when I did start going into these watch stores, I felt like, people didn't really want to help me out, or they could tell that I wasn't an expert or a multimillionaire ready to spend a lot of money on watches. And being able to have the anonymity and having that frictionless kind of consumer experience would be really beneficial to some. And to be able to do that in the comfort of your own home really kind of removes all anxiety and kind of just the negative aspects of the experience that could completely antagonize a potential client.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's been in a Parisian boutique sees that folks get treated differently, right? And it's there in striking detail. I think what's interesting, though, on the brand side is sort of the opposite, right? Find me somebody who is future forward enough to, let's say, even claim a free NFT related to a watch, but is grounded in history enough to want to spend what they spend on a watch. That's a really interesting consumer. That is somebody that you probably want to learn a lot about. And I think other than, in normal ways of retail, you buy something, you get information from the customer, and then you hope they come again, right? When you're giving someone an NFT, what you're essentially doing is giving them a wallet with a digital good in it. And in the same way that I have a 6-year-old son and I recently gave him a wallet and I put $1 in it once in a while and he feels very special, that's what you're doing when you give someone an NFT. You're creating an intimate relationship where you can continue to reward that consumer through this shared wallet, which holds this NFT. And you can see what they respond to. So I think not only is it, I think most importantly, and I'm really glad you said that, a really wonderful way to sort of break down social stigmatization from creators, buyers, really everyone in that universe. It's also just candidly a really wonderful marketing tool for companies and a really wonderful engagement and data mining tool. And it's really nice that you can sort of have that really hard business interest, but also aligning with something that I think we all would say is important socially.
Yeah, and I would add one thing. I mean, I think we're talking about an industry that has been operating in one capacity for hundreds of years and that prides itself on having, I would say, localized relationships with its clients where that last upwards of decades. And it becomes problematic when that relationship is completely anonymous and you don't know where the person's calling from or what their motives are, particularly with watches where, again, it's about access and you have 100 people that want for every one watch that's being produced. And that ultimately you would want that watch to go someone to who you have a relationship with that is going to be a good caretaker for the watch for the next generation and that only has positive intent. But I think as far as the experience goes of being in a store and being treated poorly, I mean, like, ultimately that's just unacceptable and the brands need to adapt and that should never be the case. And I think that over time, as the brands realize that their customers are changing and getting younger and more dynamic, that you're going to see those experiences turn on their head.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said is maybe the key, though, when you talked about community, right? I do believe it's important that anyone can play if they've got the money and the intent. And no matter how nicely spaces are set up, people feel excluded from spaces for tons of sociocultural reasons that are all valid, right? And it's baked into the entire system. So I love the idea personally that the anonymity of NFTs can give everyone an equal starting point. But I think it's exactly what you said about NFTs that are the key. Can the NFTs not stop with the anonymity, but can they be a community development mechanism to learn more and more about these folks so that maybe they would never have come to you if they had to go in that store, but now they will. But thanks to the rewarding and learning and engaging them, they now are a valued member of the community. In some cases, you may know even more about them, and then you know they'll be a good steward of these, amazing assets.
Hello, and thank you for a great talk. I have a question to anyone who can answer, obviously. It's two different questions, actually. I hope you can answer both. The first one is, when it comes to NFTs and the watch industry, manufacturers take a little bit more time to adopt to new things. But what's stopping companies like WatchBox or other marketplaces from incorporating NFTs into the watch industry? The second question is, let's say that there comes a day where watch manufacturers like Patek, Rolex, or AP start to incorporate NFTs. How would that affect something like something that used to be part of the norm of watch collecting, which is selling a watch to buy something else? How would that affect doing such a thing when NFTs exist and a retailer or a watch manufacturer would know that person XYZ sold this certain watch? Would that negatively affect them? And would that be a negative thing of implementing NFTs into watch collecting?
I feel like that one was to me.
Yeah.
So I think that, again, as far as the buying, selling, or trading of watches, obviously it's something that we do on a global basis, and we understand the sensitivities that collectors face buying a watch and wanting to sell it. I do think time matters, right? I think if you are fortunate enough to receive a watch and you decide to sell it after 2 weeks, then perhaps you shouldn't have accepted that watch, right? Because your motive is obviously, the intent is to profit off of having received it. Now, if 2 years has gone by and the warranty's elapsed and you've worn it and you need to buy, sell, or trade that watch, in order to fund the purchase of your next watch, that's a completely different conversation. And I think that ultimately the brands themselves will figure out a way to embrace this. And I think RM has actually done a great job at this in terms of their warranties now have space for the next client in order to have their name registered with the brand. And this is because it's been ingrained in us to want to be in the archives of the manufacturer, to want to be recognized that we're the owner of the watch. And so I think that you're going to see this, you're going to see this change over time as it becomes more acceptable to trade your watch. I think the cost of these items has also gone up dramatically. And so, and how many watches people were buying has gone up. So if you go back 20, 30 years, you may have only had 2 watches, 3 watches in your entire collection. We meet clients that have hundreds of watches, like rooms of just watches on the walls and in drawers. And so, to have a conversation with this person that they shouldn't be allowed to trade their watch that they may have never even worn and they've had it for 5 years. I mean, it's crazy. Like, you would expect that person should be able to trade it for something else. And so I think it's education. I think that it takes time for many of the watch brands to embrace change. And when they do, they really do a great job of adopting it. I think it's just, again, I think it's a timing thing. I think it's the same thing that happened with the internet. And fast forward 5, 10 years, I think you're going to see many of the brands embracing the secondary market. They're going to have a better understanding of it and a way to embrace it.
And as someone who spends all day convincing brands to embrace change, I would just say this, my phone stopped working recently and I really need a new one. I'm not going to buy this new one until I see how it works out for some other people, right? I think having some disbelief of new trends is probably a good thing, especially when you have such history and provenance on the line. But I do think as someone working inside the NFT industry, we really have gone from a place of collectibles and stocks and places where the value is sort of hard to see and very mercurial to a place where it does make sense for brands now. So the fact that watches perhaps have been slow to this industry, I might just say they're a little more circumspect, and now is a better time to engage than had they jumped in earlier. You have these brands that are hundreds of years old and mean so much. You can't risk them, right? And I think now the opportunity, I would say, outweighs the risk. Maybe one last question, so we'll stay on time.
Here. Hi. It sounded like when you were talking about NFTs, and this is from a complete NFT numpty. I mean, I have absolutely no clue about any of this stuff. But I'm also an artist and a designer, and so the discussion that you had around patronage obviously really spoke to me because I think that is one of the sort of barriers, especially for young artists coming out, is that's actually what you're looking for. It's not clients, it's patrons. Even for what we do as a brand, we've never really spoken about customers or clients or even connoisseurs. They're really patrons because they don't need what we make. They're supporting somebody's creative journey, if you like. So what I thought was really interesting was it sounds to me like the NFT itself isn't really of any value. It's what you use the NFT for that then gives it more and more or less and less value. Like, for example, associating experiences with it or an opportunity to meet the artist or, this really clever thing of, okay, you have to wait 5 years. A very inexpensive way of adding value is make the experience time amazing rather than trying to speed up your production process. That's really clever. So my question is, though, what is, maybe this is kind of something that Nicholas can speak to. What was it about using NFTs to kind of tap into that patronage aspect rather than, say, a tool like Patreon? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because in a sense, they're both roads to having that sort of patronage side of things. And it would be interesting to understand why it is that the NFT side you feel was more valuable or, I don't know, gave you a better connection or...
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, you always kind of have to experiment, and artists are, usually really good about trying out new things, right? And so to say one is better than the other, I can't necessarily say that to you. You might find more of an audience down one avenue, the Patreon avenue versus NFTs. For me, it was, I had reluctant optimism when I got into it. There were things that maybe I didn't like about it or didn't make sense about it to me. So I didn't, go all in. I started small and saw what happened. And if you go back to my original story of getting into it, I ended up putting it on one marketplace and nothing really happened, right? I didn't get a lot of traction. But then through something that's a little bit more traditional, like hitching yourself to a gallery or a space or people that you really trust who can promote and market your work, it was successful. And I think in some ways, what we saw in the traditional art market, we've really seen in the digital space just at hyper speed, right? So I don't know if it discounts this idea that you should look for people that you trust that maybe aren't artists but are more gallerists or people that can promote your work for you. And in terms of the experience or kind of creating stipulations to have people hold on to your work for an extended period of time, I can't pretend to know about that or if that is a good direction to go or not. But I would say just try it, just look for different ways that you can kind of get your stuff out there.
Yeah, and I would say too, I just want to clarify, NFTs do have value as collectibles. I collect basketball cards, they are cardboard. I collect sneakers, which cost $9 to make and sell for tens of thousands of dollars. They don't have value other than the collectability value and the emotional value. And many NFTs still have floor prices in the tens of thousands of dollars, if not more. And I think what's interesting, though, to your point, is NFTs can be a really great way for patronage and asset building. So rather than just a Kickstarter fund, let's say, or a Patreon where we're paying you as the artist to support you, well, that's great. We want to support you. We're in partnership. But at the end of the day, we don't have this asset that can trade and have value. Whereas an NFT, to your point, through the utility is a form of patronage. But if it works, if he continues to be the art star that he is, the asset, the NFT that you have, actually increases in value. And if he's the one that sold it to you, he participates in that upside. So I think the more sophisticated conversations are on utility and patronage, but this is still a multi-billion-dollar collectibles market. It's just, I think, a more rational and realistic one than it was, months and years ago.
And it's also created value where there was none. I think like sports games are a really good example where like what is a game from 2 years ago worth? And today it's worth nothing because the game is from 2 years ago. But if they can digitize that game and create moments, someone that was there at that game with their son that remembers that dunk may be they may be willing to pay $100 for that moment. And so it's really just comes back to it's worth whatever one person in the world is willing to pay. And that's what all of this is, right? A watch is just, it could be a little piece of gold and some brass components, but, society has dictated that it's worth something and that it's art. And so I think it just comes back to exactly that is the recognition that it is art in just a different form.
I don't know if we're hard stop. We want to do... Sure. I don't ever stop the party, so.
So yeah, you guys have talked a lot about the utility for NFTs in terms of like the manufacturer and what they can get out of it, and that would be amazing if Rolex could take a look at what clients are servicing their watches every 2 years and taking care of them, and then distribute those watches to those clients. That would be amazing. But what benefits do you see the consumers getting out of it in terms of the recording? Like, if bigger entities that sell watches can, track service history and, like really tell the provenance of a watch, before they sell it to somebody, the consumer can, read it as well, dictate the value of the watch. We talk about the consumer end.
Yeah, I think you talked about, it's all about rewarding consumers. You have consumers who do things that the brand values, whether it's buying a certain amount of them or holding them for a certain time. When you have this data link to the consumer in a more dynamic way, almost like a dynamic CRM, so to speak, you can reward them. You know who they are, and you can it's like me putting another dollar in my son's wallet when he does something good. And that's not something that is widely or very well done in the consumer world beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, again, a lot has to happen for all of that to be tracked, right? I mean, you have service centers all over the world that are third-party service centers that aren't necessarily tied to the brand itself for many brands. And so to know that a particular watch was serviced here in this country and it ended up back to you, like a lot has to happen for all of that to work. And I think that that's, again, like that would be a long-term aspiration. But I think in the short term, again, it's a way to engage with you if you didn't purchase it from the brand itself, whether it's an event, whether it's news about a product offering, whether perhaps a brand offers you a product first because they're coming out with a variation or a different edition that you purchased the first one 5 years later, right? So, I mean, again, I think that there's a lot that they can take it, and I think that even if it's just a small connection to the brand, a small tether, like it's on them to now strengthen that and create more engagement. And because everyone's vying for the market share of the wallet, and so I think if a brand does a very good job of engaging with a client, they can take more market share and grow and do better.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Fun time.